Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Lurie Center Coffee Convo tonight. I'm Kelly Dakin, and I'm the Associate Scientific Director at the Lurie Center for Autism, and we're just so happy to have you all joining us this evening for a conversation about the role of genetics in autism. And we're delighted to have two wonderful speakers joining us this evening. I'm going to share their introductions in just a minute, but wanted to just briefly share the outline for tonight's talk. First, Dr. Quao is going to talk to us about the science of human genetics and what researchers are learning about autism by studying genetics. And then Dr. Mierau will talk to us about what families can learn from genetic testing. So for families who might be considering genetic testing, what are the potential benefits and limitations of that testing? And she will also run through an opportunity to participate in autism research that involves genetics. So and then at the end, we're saving time for questions. That's a key part of these conversations. So we'll definitely have time at the end. Please save your questions till then, although you're more than welcome, and we encourage you to pop them into the chat if you know how to do that. And we will get to as many as we can at the end. Okay. Next, I'd like to just briefly introduce our two speakers. First, Dr. Quao is a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Genomic Medicine at Mass General Hospital. Her research focuses on understanding genetic and phenotypic variation across development among people with autism, as well as individuals with neuropsychiatric conditions. She's been studying autism for almost a decade, starting in her PhD program in clinical psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Quao completed her clinical internship at the UCLA Medical Center, where she also helped provide therapy for autistic adolescents and adults. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Quao. And I'd also like to take a moment to introduce my colleague, Dr. Susanna Mierau. Dr. Mierau is a neurologist at the Lurie Center for Autism, so perhaps some of you have previously interacted with her. She also is in the Department of Cognitive and Behavioral Neurology at the Brigham. She specializes in the care of adults with autism spectrum disorder, as well as other neurodevelopmental conditions. Dr. Mierau earned her doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Oxford and her MD from Harvard Medical School. She trained in neurology at Mass General Hospital, and currently, in addition to seeing patients, she has a laboratory that is interested in understanding how genetic changes that cause autism affect the development of brain circuits. So thank you both for being here this evening. And I am going to pass the floor to Dr. Quao to kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here and to be able to share with you some of what we've been finding out about genetic heterogeneity in the autistic and autism community. So I don't really have any financial disclosures that are related to this presentation. I'm purely a researcher, mostly looking at autism genetics is my current focus. So can go on to the next slide. Oh. Dr. Dakin, could you go on to the next slide? I think I'm not seeing it.
Oh, why is it not advancing for me? Apologies.
I'm happy to share from my end, if that would be helpful.
Possibly. Gee, it was working just a second ago.
maybe just stop sharing it and then reshare it and see if it moves.
Mhm.
Yeah, my computer is frozen. Let me see if I can just exit out and join back in. I'm so sorry for this.
Oh, it's-
Susan, are you able to screen share? Because then it might just switch over to you.
Yeah, let me try that. Um, gonna replace the current sharing. Are you guys seeing the big screen or the little screen?
We're seeing the presenter view.
Oh, okay, so displays. Okay, you guys have it.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Great. Okay. So to start off, I wanted to emphasize that there will be focusing mostly on talking about the genetic variation involved in autism. Um, Autism is heavily influenced by both genetic and environmental factors, and there's a wide variety of these factors that contribute to autism. So on one hand, on the left side of the screen, we can see that there's both inherited genetic variation as well as de novo genetic variation, which we'll talk about later, but also plenty of environmental factors like pollution, mom being ill during pregnancy, not having enough folic acid, or taking a medicine while pregnant. These are all factors that interact with each other. And we're just beginning to really understand how they're interacting with each other. But for now, I'm just going to be focusing mainly on the genetic factors. So, how strong really are the genetic effects in autism? The likelihood of receiving an autism diagnosis we know is generally around 1 to 3%. And it turns out if an older biological sibling has an autism diagnosis, the likelihood of a child receiving an autism diagnosis is 8 times greater than this 1 to 3%. And also, if a cousin has an autism diagnosis, the chances of a child receiving an autism diagnosis is about 2 times greater. This and many other studies, including of monozygotic compared to dizygotic twins, have shown us overall that autism has heritability, or the overall amount of variation in autism's diagnosis that's attributable to genetic effects is estimated to be approximately 80%. So that is 20% of the variation we think would come from the environmental effects on autism. But despite that, we currently are not using genetic variants to diagnose autism because autism is a behavioral diagnosis, and you have to go through the neurodevelopmental and neuropsychiatric evaluations to gain an autism diagnosis, not a clinical genetic testing. But we can also talk a little bit later about the ways in which genetic variation can help explain some of um, uh, the potential symptoms that a person with autism diagnosis might be experiencing. So autism's genetic influences are extremely diverse. The probability of receiving an autism diagnosis is represented in this little donut of a pie chart. And we can see that there's just many types of variation. Basically, right over here, what we can see is that out of that 80% heritability, there's a whole ton of variation that's inherited, about 2/3, 67%, that we currently are still in the process of discovering, but it's not quite accounted for yet. And what we've discovered so far is more of this part of the donut. So really, um, uh, if you don't have this 10% accounted for, it's only about 25% of the genetic variation that we have some explanation for currently. And these genetic variants can include things like de novo changes, which are a new change in a DNA that's not inherited from a parent. There's also common variants and rare variants, which we'll talk about next. So de novo changes are new in a child, and they're basically a genetic change that occurs either in the egg from the biological mother or the sperm from the biological father, or potentially after fertilization, after the egg and sperm meet and there is an embryo. And these de novo changes, everyone carries some of these, and they can occur anywhere in the genome. It turns out that 20 to 30% of individuals with autism have these de novo changes in genes that are known to be linked to autism. And then when we talk about common variants, there's inherited common variation that's observed in over 1% of the population. And individually, they have very, very small effects. So a common variant we could call like a single nucleotide polymorphism, which is a common single base change in DNA. So here's our DNA, and there's these bases, and you just have one change, and loads of people have these changes, including those that may be associated with autism. One way to think about the common variant effects is thinking about height, for example. So common variants that are associated with growth can contribute to a range of heights across people. And you can see this is just a lineup of people by height. So going from 5 feet all the way to 6'5". The folks in white are female biologically, and the folks in the navy sweaters are male. And you can just see that there's a distribution of heights across people, and they generally follow this kind of a bell curve. You can sort of think a similar thing for autism and the common variants that are associated with autism. They can contribute to a range of autistic traits across people, but most people, only a few people will actually receive an autism diagnosis, and those people generally have more of the common variants that are associated with autism. When we then think about rare variants, these are variants that are often not inherited, just like those de novo changes that we mentioned earlier. And they're observed in under 1% of the population, so that's why they're rare. But in comparison to the common variants, they individually can have very large effects. Some of these rare variants, they can be changes in a single base or a letter of DNA. It could be like an insertion, a deletion. So you insert a base, you delete a base, you could duplicate a base, you could even invert a base, or you can have these changes in large chunks of DNA, like this translocation, which you can just see is just a whole chunk that's just being swapped between the chromosome arms. And in the context of height, again, this is can be a useful example. Rare variants in genes that are important for growth can cause extremes in height. So some folks can be really very short or very tall. One example is that people with Marfan syndrome often have very long limbs due to a rare variant in the FBN1 gene. And so there's a few folks who carry rare variants that can really push them towards these extremes in height, either towards the short end or the tall end of the extreme. And that can actually be accompanied also by, as you can imagine, many other sorts of health consequences. So as with height, an autism diagnosis is influenced by both common and rare genetic variants. And on the left, we can see in green, across lots of people, we can see that they have different sorts of average effects of all the trait-associated common variants. So some people will have just a few, and some people have more. And more or less, you will see that with the overall number of and average effects of the common variants associated with autism, that will help explain some of why they might receive an autism diagnosis. On the other hand, on the right, there's people who might carry a rare variant, like a de novo variant, that is associated with autism. And because it has an individually large effect, just having that rare variant can just cause potentially a change in some of the symptoms they experience and then predispose them to have an autism diagnosis. But overall, people sharing the same common variants or rare variant will often still show very different traits. And I think it's the heterogeneity in autism that is particularly complex and makes it such a puzzle to try to discover the genes and the rare variants and the common variants that are associated. And as with height, for some people with autism, certain rare genetic variants can be diagnosed through clinical genetic testing. And this is important because it can help explain other health challenges, such as seizures and heart problems. And that in and of itself can be useful in terms of figuring out recommendations for additionally supporting folks with autism diagnoses. Autism's common genetic influences can help describe some of the diversity in autistic experiences. So autism, interestingly, shares common variant influences with other neuropsychiatric conditions. So that means that there's other conditions with their own common variant influences. And it turns out that they overlap a fair amount with the common variant influences in autism. So there's about 37% that's shared with ADHD. There's 45% approximately shared with major depression and 22% shared with schizophrenia. And there's other conditions, but I just wanted to highlight those three as ones that we know so far as having a fair amount of overlap with other neuropsychiatric traits. Autism's common genetic influences also overlap with common genetic influences on higher educational attainment. So folks who have more of the common variants associated with autism often go further in school on average. And it turns out autism's common genetic influences are higher among autistic people without co-occurring intellectual disability than autistic people with intellectual disability. So basically, people who don't have who have an autism diagnosis but don't have intellectual disability tend, on average, to have more of these common variants associated with autism than people with autism diagnoses and intellectual disability diagnoses. And the ways that we can look at that are by analyzing data, genetic data, from over 18,000 autistic people and 27,000 people without autism diagnoses. And these were the numbers that were included in the largest study of autism's common genetic influences, which is the primary analyses are in the lab that I work in, the Robinson lab, in part. And the ways that we analyze, again, might be just to see whether, for example, in a single base pair, just comparing the genetic bases in a person without an autism diagnosis and an autistic person, and just seeing how they differ across all of these people. Autism's rare genetic influences, on the other hand, can help us provide some biological clues. And most of the autism genes discovered to date, we know, are highly conserved across species. So that means that they are similar across different species, and they're also sensitive to genetic variation that can turn off the gene. So anytime there's a genetic variant that might switch off the gene is really going to show a lot of the gene basically is not very tolerant to those kinds of changes. There's other genes, of course, that if you just turn it on or off, it doesn't have as profound of an effect as a lot of the genes that are associated with autism. So overall, this suggests that they're really essential to our survival and our biological functions. Many of these genes influence the communication that's happening between the neurons, the brain cells, and also the regulation of gene expression. So turning on or off of gene. So it turns out that these functions often have to do with how our brain cells are talking to each other and when or how much our brains are producing proteins that will affect those kinds of functions. Genes associated with both autism and intellectual disability generally turn on earlier in fetal brain development than genes that are associated with autism only. So again, this sort of starts to paint a picture where we're thinking that perhaps some of the genes that are associated more broadly with autism and intellectual disability, those might have something to do more with the earlier development of the brain, compared to genes that might just be associated with autism only. And the ways that we can study and identify these rare genetic variations are often through large studies of lots of families, particularly families where we can analyze the biological mother, the biological father, a child with an autism diagnosis, and a sibling without an autism diagnosis. And this together, by analyzing the variants that are shared and not shared between these individual members of the family, and then looking across many, many families, we can start to identify these very rare, under 1% variants. And so far, we've been able to analyze over 54,000 participants from families of people with neurodevelopmental disabilities in the largest study to date of autism's rare genetic influences. And this is also something that's also happening at labs that we're collaborating with, and we are contributing currently to analyses that are continuing to build upon more and more of the participants and allowing us to basically discover more genes associated with autism. And so one example of ways in which autism's rare genetic influences might affect development is by looking at kids who do or don't carry an impactful, non-inherited de novo rare variant, like what we are terming these neurodevelopmental disability associated variants. So here we have a timeline of children of ages 0 to 7 years. And we're seeing these developmental milestones like smiling, walking, speaking words, speaking phrases, bladder training, and bowel training. And these are all happening approximately on average by 4 years, but you can see there's quite a bit of variability. This is where 25% of people and 75% of people have reached these developmental milestones. And so on top, these are kids who don't carry one of these variants. And on the bottom are kids who do carry these variants. And you can just see that on average, the timing with which they're attaining these developmental milestones is often somewhat delayed. And you can see there's just overall greater variability. It's just stretched out more, the timings when they attain these developmental milestones, if they carry one of these rare de novo neurodevelopmental disability associated variants. And in order to do this, we needed to include over 5,000 children to be able to detect these sorts of differences. And this is a paper that we recently put out in JAMA Pediatrics. So overall, the key takeaways are that autism is really influenced by genetics and the environment and an interaction between the two. And these genetic influences are extremely diverse and still mostly unknown. As you can see, there's so much more of that donut chart that I showed you earlier that we still have to discover. And it turns out that we need very large numbers of autistic people and their families from various genetic backgrounds to better understand these influences. And we do find that as we include more and more people in our studies, we have more of what we call the statistical power that we need in order to be able to capture more of the rare and common variants. And I think Dr. Mierau will be able to talk next about one of these genetic study efforts, which have been included in all the studies I described earlier. And I think if you'd like that, I can continue to share the slides, or you can continue from there. What would work for y'all?
Okay, I've switched the slides to here, I think.
Oh, okay. I will end
As I
the
was
show.
going to say, easier
Yeah,
to say next.
for sure. Okay, I'm going to end my show from my end. Stop
Yeah,
screen
I was
share.
going to say
Okay.
shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
So as Kelly and Susan mentioned, I'll be speaking about what families can learn from genetic testing. I also saw in the chat that there are a couple questions about genetic testing, and so I'll try to address those. And then we also will feature one opportunity that the Lurie Center and MGH more broadly are actually Brigham too, that we're participating in a study called Spark, where people can contribute to this. But as Susan mentioned, there are actually many large studies going on around the world. That's a really exciting time for autism genetics. So I just made just a couple of slides because I was just going to talk about it, but then I thought, well, some people are probably visual learners. So what are the potential benefits of going to a clinician and having autism-related genetic testing ordered? And by autism-related genetic testing, I mean that, there are a few genetic testing centers in the country that offer clinically relevant levels of saying, can we find a gene that is likely or is the cause of autism in that individual who was tested? This is not the same as I saw somebody mention a question about this. I'm not going to pronounce it right, but it's like Intel XX was one of the questions, which is different. There are a number of private companies who offer, these tests that look for little variants that are seen in the population, then try to make predictions on these. This is not the same. This type of clinical testing is, can we find a gene? And we think right now, probably in at least 10% of people, we can find the gene. And I suspect that number will rise thanks to Susan and many other people like her work. So I think for me as a clinician, when I'm talking to families, one of the things that really motivates us as a potential immediate benefit of finding the cause of the autism is if the autism is part of a syndrome, and by syndrome we mean there's more than one thing happening other than just the autistic symptoms, but for example, maybe at risk for epilepsy, or in many cases that sometimes other organ systems are involved. And this is particularly important because many of you who may know me as a clinician know that I work with a lot of people, especially adults in our clinic, who have either no ability or very limited ability to communicate pain or discomfort in their body. And for many patients and families and we feel that if we can find out that you're at higher risk of, GI, kidney, heart, otherwise we might not know until things have very seriously progressed. And so this is one of the potential immediate benefits. The other thing that many of our families who've gotten genetic results have found is that they're able to join support groups that are specific for the genetic cause of autism. And that can be particularly helpful, particularly for people who have these very rare variants that Susan was talking about. And in many cases, these support groups are national or even international because maybe there isn't anybody else in the Boston area with this particular cause. And many of our families have even gone to conferences that the families have where they meet other people and figure out and this is also a good way to attract researchers to get interested in the specific genes to find out why do these genes cause autism and to work on different therapies. One of the things that I didn't necessarily anticipate when we started delivering results, but I know that, Wendy Chung, who leads the SPARK studies, said that this is something that she as a clinical geneticist has encountered. But sometimes when we find a gene, the parents look quite shell-shocked. And it's not that they didn't believe that there might be a genetic cause when we sent the testing, but in many cases, people have carried, sometimes I work with adults, decades of guilt, worried that something that they did or didn't do in a timely fashion during the pregnancy or at time of birth led to their loved ones' difficulties. And so I think that in some ways it can be quite another immediate benefit. And then the other one, which it shouldn't have to be a benefit this way, and you certainly don't need a genetic result in order to get services from DDS. But many of you may be aware that there's been significant gender bias in the diagnosis of autism, particularly the underdiagnosis of women. And I have met many adult women who carry a diagnosis of intellectual disability, but clearly undeniably meet the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. And the only difference between them and the men who have autism and intellectual disability is that they're a woman. And many of these women, when we identify in adulthood, yes, this is autism, and they would benefit from the same services as men the same age, they can't get the services because nobody wants to believe it. And in many cases, the genetic diagnosis comes back with, one of the most well-known, autism gene variants, and that's been successful at helping us get services for individual, but also counter some of the gender bias that still exists in autism diagnosis. But I think there are also really big potential benefits to our community of clinical testing to our community. And that's as we identify people with similar genetic causes of autism. There's a saying that's popular at the Lurie Center, but I know it's popular among others too, that if you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that's what we recognize, is that there's probably not, one or two, there's not even hundreds, there's likely thousands of different causes of autism, because social communication and interaction are some of the most difficult and highest level things that we do as humans. And so there's many different ways that can become challenging and to different degrees. And one of the challenges to autism research as a whole, right, is that when we use autism as the criteria, right, you're going to get this wide range, and it can be difficult to identify, particularly identify new therapies. But if we can start to group patients by the genetic underlying cause, we might be able to develop new therapies and make a little colorful example of this. Of course, there's more than 3 groups, but one of the exciting parts is if we call group number 1 around a gene called MECP2 or MECP2, which causes Rett syndrome. In 2023, we had the first FDA-approved drug, specifically that was based on research done that started with the knowledge of the gene. So I think there is something exciting ahead. We're not at the level. I looked at the Intellex DNA test website that somebody put in the chat and looked. The articles that they reference in the literature for how it works were like 4 and 6 patients, and that's really not sufficient. Moreover, using what they call single nucleotide polymorphisms to try to predict what types of food and medicine you should eat, I don't think we're really there. I mean, you might be able to argue, evidence for one or, like here or there, but as a field, we're not there. And even some of the genetic testing that's offered that's supposed to predict which psychiatric medications are supposed to work best for you for depression, our clinicians have found that it's not actually as predictive as we'd hope. But I agree with them that the ultimate goal is to move in that direction, right? Where we can learn more about what each person's body needs and then try to come up with ways to address that. I think there was another question about getting genetic testing for autism and ADHD coming up. ADHD genetics, to my knowledge, is less understood than autism right now. And I would recommend getting, rather than looking for specific variants, making sure the testing is going to one of the few clinical centers, clinical testing sites that is kind of at the leading edge of integrating the knowledge from many of these large genetic studies. And we hope that SPARK will be part of that. So I've talked about on the clinical side, there's also many opportunities to participate in research and to give genetic information research, whether you want information back for yourself or whether you want to kind of contribute to the research and our ability to understand autism through the different genes involved. So the Lurie Center, along with Mass General Brigham, we're going to participate in this study called SPARK, which stands for Simons Powering Autism Research. And I'm not really sure where the K comes from, but the Simons Foundation is a very large charitable foundation that funds autism research as one of its goals. It also funds a lot of astronomy, math and other interesting things in case you look them up. But they're supporting one of the largest national online autism study, but we'll be able to do the testing in the clinic as well. It's just a cheek swab. There's also opportunity for people to give blood if that's available. I mean, not available, but some of my patients can't tolerate blood draws, so that wouldn't be it. The ultimate purpose or mission, is to speed up research and advance our understanding of autism so that we can, in the long run, improve people's lives. And what I think is super cool about this study is the goal is to recruit over 50,000 families with autism. And you think that's a big number, but they already last year published a study with like already 40,000. So only 10 more thousand to go. So we're going to participate in that here. So people can elect if they want to get results back. So there's a certain number of genes that if they're very confident that those genes cause autism, if you have one of the changes they've seen in that list, they will let you know. It might be a long time, months or even more than a year, but they will let you know. But then also too, there's a number of other research studies that are associated with Spark, so people looking at the specific genes or doing other research with autism. So there's a lot of opportunities to participate at different levels. So if you have a little time, you can just give a cheek swab and some information. If you have more time, you can participate in many different studies. So one of the ways that families can participate in Spark already is to register online. If you put in Spark and autism into your favorite search engine, you'll get there right away. But you can also, if you remember, you can go to sparkforautism.org. There you would sign a consent form and it would explain exactly what the data is going to be used, how it will be protected, and so on. You give information about the family, for example, who in the family has autism, and then consent to the DNA analysis. So then they send a little kit where you just like brushing the side of your gum. You just put that in and send it back, and then they also send some surveys. And then over the time, they will process this data and they use this to do a number of studies. Now, for people who want to participate through the Lurie Center or through one of the we're also the Bresler Clinic at the MGH, where many autistic individuals are seen. They're also participating, and also will be collecting samples at Brigham as well. So when if you sign up through the web portal or if you join through one of our clinics, you'll be the option to find out if they find one of the autism genes on the list, whether you want to know or not. You can still participate in the study even if you don't want to know. But there's a very small number of genes that are unrelated to autism but could be life-saving. This might be like hereditary forms of cancer or heart disease, for example. There's a small list from the American College of Medical Genetics, and you can say whether you want any of these to be identified. For some people, they might choose not to do this because of like life insurance or other concerns like that in the future. But for many of my patients who have limited verbal skills or limited ability to report pain, we're actually quite keen on finding these. And so if you have any questions about this, you should reach out to your physician because they can help you know more. What's really cool here is if there is a gene found, and so here is an example of a gene called FOXP1. Then they send and say, this is the gene that was found, here's some information about it, and then they can give a little bit more information, and you can share that with your doctor and other clinical providers if you like. And so far through these studies, which I said they already have tons of new patients, they've identified new genes linked to autism. They've also estimate now that, at least 20 to 30% of the risk comes from these new changes. And so, as Susan was mentioning, when we talk about de novo genetic changes, sometimes it's hard for people to understand that we can have a genetic cause, but it's not inherited, meaning we didn't get it from our parents. And that's because we all start out as one cell, right? The fertilized egg. And then we turn into billions and billions of cells, like to make a whole human. And of course, when the genetic information is getting copied, little errors or little changes can be made. And sometimes those changes have no effect on the function. Sometimes they have a positive effect, and sometimes they may have, an effect that makes life more difficult. And so that's an important thing to understand when we're talking about de novo changes, is that your loved one, could have a genetic cause of autism that is not present in any other family members. And so that's important to understand. So there's also likely still more genes to find. And I especially like, in addition to Spark, which is trying to get a wide swath of the American population, there's also studies going on in the Middle East and Asia and many different parts of the world where we're trying to make sure that we have a wide range of people from different backgrounds to make sure that we're getting good coverage in identifying the genes. So from Spark's perspective, what's the advantage as a family of participating? So as I said, they already had over 40,000 families, which apparently ties up to over 100,000 people already contributing. So it's a chance to be part of, a really big research project that is likely going to enhance our data, our knowledge. And they also, too, this is a way to get researchers in the medical community interested in autism, interested in understanding how these genes affect the brain development and behavior, but also it's also a way to get a large group of autism families and people together to participate in related studies. And of course, this participation in additional studies is completely optional. It says you can get an Amazon gift card once you complete the thing, so that's a potential benefit. And then, of course, a small percentage of people will receive a genetic diagnosis and get kind of personalized reports. Now, what if in research or the clinical testing you don't find a result, get a result? Does that mean there isn't a genetic cause? I think the answer is likely no. It's just our knowledge is not complete yet. So usually what we recommend clinically is that wait a few years and things will change. So to learn more, again, it's Spark for Autism, or I always forget this website, even though it's quite years. So in clinic, I'm constantly putting into the web browser Spark space autism, and it pulls it right up as the first one. So if you don't remember, all you need to do is remember their clever Spark logo here. And you can also call the Lurie Center or contact us at Lurie Center Research. We have a wonderful research coordinator working on this project.